Hey, I think I'll give it a couple minutes to see if anybody else hops on. Did have some people register, so hopefully we'll get a few.
Sorry, I had you muted, but I heard you at the end.
Oh, okay. Looks like we're starting to get a couple people.
Cool.
All right, so I think we can go ahead and get started. So let's go ahead and introduce myself. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Danny Smith, and I'm the City of Albany's Housing Services Advocate. Today we're going to be talking about good cause eviction protections for tenants in the City of Albany. This presentation is part of the Good Neighbor School, which is education for landlords and tenants by the City of Albany. And I'm also joined today by Canyon Ryan from United Tenants of Albany, and I will allow you to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Canyon. As Danny said, I'm the executive director at United Tenants of Albany. We've been around for almost 50 years.
Awesome. Thanks, Canyon. Thanks for joining today. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get into it. Just as a quick note for anyone who is newer to Zoom, you'll notice either at the top or the bottom of your screen, there should be a control bar, and you're welcome to use the Q&A or the chat feature to ask any questions that you have throughout the session. Be pausing periodically to answer those. My contact information will also be at the back of this presentation. And UTA's phone number will be in here a couple of times. So if you have other questions that you want to talk about to somebody offline, we'd be happy to do that with you as well. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So first, to define good cause is part of Local Law F, which was passed in the City of Albany last year in 2021. And Local Law F basically prevents Albany tenants from being evicted without a valid reason, also known as a good cause for the eviction. So some examples of what is considered a good cause to evict someone in the City of Albany would include not paying rent, significant lease violations, unreasonably refusing the landlord access to the unit, persistent nuisance activity, criminal or illegal activity. In certain situations, for a landlord who intends to own or occupy the unit, or if they have an immediate family member that's going to own or occupy the unit, that generally isn't covered under good cause. And the same would go for certain property sales. So if the property sale requires that the property be vacant at the time it's transferred, then the tenant also may not be protected under good cause. And the final example of good cause is a tenant who had agreed to vacate a unit. I believe it's 5 months in advance. So if you agree to vacate a unit 5 months in advance, and the landlord signs a lease with a new tenant, and then you change your mind, the landlord may be able to use the lease that they signed with the new tenant to pursue an eviction against you. So it's important to understand what the good causes of eviction are in Albany, but it's also more important to understand what's not considered good cause under this law. So things that are not considered good cause for eviction include an expired lease. So that means that no one in the City of Albany should be evicted just because their lease has ended. And another thing that's not considered good cause is not paying an unjustifiable rent increase. So just to clarify a little bit, since some people do seem to get confused here, good cause isn't rent control, and that landlords can set their initial rent at whatever they want. And there's also nothing stopping a landlord from raising rents above 5% as long as they have a valid reason. However, the courts are going to require the landlord to be able to back up the rent increase that they made. So some examples of reasons why a landlord could justify a rent increase would include making major improvements or renovations to the unit, market changes or inflation, increased cost, or other documented factors. In general, making basic repairs to a unit, though, that's not considered a valid reason to raise rents above 5%, just doing the bare minimum of repairs. That's just part of being a landlord. In general, if the landlord cannot justify the rent increase, then a tenant should not be evicted for paying it under good cause, for not paying it under good cause. Just one thing to note, though, is that the landlord may be able to sue you in small claims court, so that's just something to be aware of as well. And just a quick note about how much notice landlords are required to give you before raising your rent in general. If you've lived in your unit for less than a year, they're required to give you 30 days notice. If you've lived in your unit for 1 to 2 years, they're required to give you 60 days notice. And if you've lived in your unit for 2 or more years, your landlord is required to give you 90 days notice, regardless of whether you are on a year lease or a month-to-month lease. It really just matters how long you've actually lived there. So I'll kick it over to Canyon if you have anything to add at the moment, and if not, we will talk about how to use good cause.
I've got nothing to add.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so next we're going to talk about how to use good cause. I'll kind of walk through some steps that can help with figuring out how to use your protections under good cause, and then we'll turn it back over to Canyon to see if they have any insights from their court advocate program, and they can share a little bit more about what UTA does in their court advocate program over there. So this flowchart sort of walks through just the basic steps of how you could use good cause in practice. So it starts with maybe you're finding out that your landlord is not going to be renewing your lease, or that you are going to have a rent increase of above 5% without a reason. So the first thing you'd want to do would be to inform your landlord that you cannot be evicted for an expired lease in the city of Albany, and keeping in mind that you are not legally required to leave your home unless you have been legally evicted. So your landlord could respond to this conversation by proposing a new lease, in which case it would be your responsibility to read the new lease, look it over, see if it seems fair and reasonable. If so, you might want to sign the lease, and we'll talk about why that is. And if not, you basically are back at the same spot as if your landlord had not given you a new lease to sign. And at that point, the choice is yours whether you want to move out or stay in your home and fight using good cause protections. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of each option. So step one in using good cause is to ask your landlord why they're not renewing your lease or why they're increasing the rent. It's not super common, but there are a couple of situations, like I mentioned earlier in the presentation. For example, if your landlord is planning on moving to owner occupy the unit or moving an immediate family member in, then those are situations where good cause might not apply. And so the landlord not renewing your lease because they are going to move into the unit means that you would not be protected under good cause. So it's a good idea to just ask them why they're not renewing your lease. Your landlord may also be able to justify a rent increase if you ask them. So they may say, okay, well, I made these renovations to the unit, which increased the value by X amount. So therefore, I'm raising the rent. So both of those are good points of information to have going into this. So step two would be to inform your landlord about good cause. If your landlord is refusing to renew your lease without a reason or without a valid reason, you can inform them that you cannot be evicted for an expired lease in Albany. You could say something, for example, like under local law F, Albany tenants cannot be evicted without good cause. An expired lease is not good cause for eviction under this law. Similarly, if your landlord is trying to raise your rent unreasonably and without justification, you can explain to them that they will not be able to evict you for not paying that increase unless they can justify the change. So an example of how you could express this to your landlord might be under local law F. The court will assume that a rent increase above 5% without justification is an attempt to get around good cause protections. So you will not be able to evict me if I do not pay the increase. And for both of those, it can be a good idea to explain this to your landlord in writing. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with having a face-to-face conversation, but doing things in writing generally just helps to back you up later on. If things do escalate to going to court, you'll be able to show the judge that you did try to communicate with your landlord and that you informed them of good cause and that they are proceeding to violate your protections under good cause. So step 3 would be to consider how your landlord responded to that conversation. So if your landlord proposes a new lease, you'll want to carefully read it over, see whether the terms of the lease seem fair or reasonable. As I always say, when it comes to lease agreements, you'll want to keep an eye out for any illegal language. So a landlord should never be requiring you to sign over your rights as a tenant. They shouldn't be asking you to rent an apartment as is or waive the warranty of habitability, which means you would waive the right to safe and livable housing, for example, or clauses that say that you can't bring a court action against them, for example. Those are all, some specific examples of illegal leases that we've seen in Albany. So you'll just want to keep an eye out for anything like that, as well as for a rent increase. So if the rent increase seems reasonable to you, it seems fair, or you can live with it, then it may be a good idea to consider signing that lease. The reason for that is that failure to enter into a new lease after you've been given the option of a new lease is good cause for eviction, assuming that it's a reasonable lease with a reasonable rent increase. So on the other hand, if your landlord is still refusing to renew your lease, or if they are refusing to lower the rent increase, now it's time to choose whether you're going to move out and find somewhere else to live, or whether you want to stay in your home and risk facing an eviction proceeding and use your rights under good cause. So there are some pros and cons of each, and this is really meant to be just sort of a neutral examination of the costs and benefits of each option. Obviously, I don't want to dissuade anyone from using your rights under good cause at all, but I do like to make sure that everyone is aware of sort of the process and how things can play out in court if you do choose to go that route. So some of the pros of moving out would be that you resolve the situation immediately. You wouldn't have to go to court or deal with the legal proceedings, and you would generally just have the situation kind of come to an end rather quickly without having to deal with it for several weeks or months. Depending on how much your landlord is proposing to raise the rent, you may also be able to find a better deal renting somewhere else. On the other hand, the cons of moving out would include you'll have to pay for moving expenses as well as come up with first month in deposit for a new apartment. Your living situation may change, which maybe that doesn't matter to some people, but other people might really like where they live and they don't want to move. And then you'd also need to find a new place to live in what is arguably a very tight rental market right now. I know that Canyon and I both get a lot of calls from people looking for apartments, and it's really hard to find an affordable place right now. So that can make it difficult as well if you are looking to move out and just start fresh. That's something else to consider, is whether you'd be able to find a new place within your budget. So on the other hand, the pros of staying in your home and fighting the eviction would include you won't have to come up with moving expenses or first month in deposit for a new apartment. Your living situation won't change. If you really like where you're living, you can stay there. And it is your right under the law. You have an entitlement to stay in your home, and you can use that right, absolutely. On the other hand, if you do choose to stay in your home past the end of your lease, or to not pay the unjustified rent increase, you just need to be aware that you might face an eviction proceeding. And the eviction proceeding can go on for several weeks or months. It can be stressful and disruptive. There are resources available. It can be difficult to access these resources at times, but we'll talk about some of the resources that are available. And one other thing, like I did mention before, your landlord can sue you in small claims court, so you're protected from eviction, but you aren't necessarily protected from being sued in small claims court. We haven't really seen this play out too much yet, just because this law is so new, but that is something that could happen as well. So finally, if you do decide to go to court, these are just some general tips for protecting yourself against eviction, especially if you are facing an eviction without good cause. So you will need to be prepared to go to court and argue your case. It's really important to show up to court so the judge has an opportunity to hear from you and hear your side of the story, especially since in this case, you have a very good reason for why you should be allowed to stay in your home. So some tips for defending yourself against eviction would include telling the judge that you're being evicted without good cause, Ideally, the judges in Albany City Court at this point are aware of good cause and what that means, but you can also just let them know that your landlord does not have a good cause to evict you. And that should kick the ball over to your landlord's court in terms of, the judge would require the landlord to basically furnish a good cause for why they're trying to evict you. And if they don't have a valid reason, then the case should be dismissed. So at the first hearing, you can request an adjournment to allow yourself time to seek legal representation or advice. And a couple of resources here are Legal Aid Services of Northeastern New York. They can provide legal advice to tenants, and in some cases, they may be able to represent tenants in eviction court. And United Tenants of Albany will talk more about all the services that they have in the next section, but they also have a court advocate program, and so they're a good resource to reach out to as well if you are facing eviction without cause. Another tip would be to continue to pay rent, or at least offer to pay rent to your landlord and to follow your lease, because you want to make sure that you're not giving them any reasons to evict you. If you stop paying rent, then they can argue that they're evicting you for non-payment of rent, for example, or for violating the lease. And the other reason for that is that if you do offer rent money to your landlord and they accept it, then the court is going to view your landlord as accepting your continued tenancies. The court is going to see that your landlord is okay with you living there because they're still taking your money every month. So the court would require your landlord to either stop taking your money or to drop the case, because they can't, you can't have it both ways, basically. And finally, a general tip for defending yourself against eviction would be to check to see if your home has a rental occupancy permit. So in the city of Albany, every property is required to have a rental occupancy permit if you are going to be renting it out. This is basically a document that means that code enforcement has come in and done an inspection and didn't find any significant safety hazards. So it's supposed to be a protective measure for tenants. And on the other hand, tenants in the city of Albany whose apartments do not have an ROP are not supposed to be evicted from those units. So if your unit doesn't have an ROP, in addition to your being evicted without good cause, that adds an extra layer of defense. So it is worth checking to see if your unit has an ROP. So I'll see if Canyon has anything to add about the court advocate program at United Tenants, maybe any insights that they have from that program at all.
Yeah, so I just want to also add, like you said, when you're signing a new lease, it's important you're aware of your rights. The law supersedes any lease, but the court may say, well, you did sign it, but at the end of the day, you have a right to a trial if that's how far you want to take it. And like Danny said, too, that can be really stressful, but it's worth it if you like where you live, and you shouldn't have to be, you shouldn't have your rent raised to the extent that you have to leave with good cause. Also, United Tenants, almost all of the cases that we're assisting tenants in defending themselves in court, because we don't have a legal program, it's a court advocate. A lot of those cases have to do with rental arrears. So we can cover up to $2,100, or if you've been impacted by COVID, potentially 6 months back of rent. And there's other grants too. We can help people move if that's what has to happen. So maybe it's not an eviction. Say the court advocate is able to negotiate with the landlord, waive these arrears, and we'll have this tenant move by the end of the month or something like that. But like Danny said too, that's really difficult in the present rental market. The new fair market rents just came out last week. They've increased on average about $100 per unit. So we're seeing higher costs in rent, and the area median income actually went down from compared to last year too. So less income, higher rents. We're facing a serious issue here. So it makes sense that people would want to stay where they live. And it also makes sense that landlords would want to hike the rent without making any repairs, because they see, well, generally I can make more money if you leave, if you're in a solid lease. We haven't been able, or I guess we haven't had a situation where the defense was good cause. And in part that's because the law was overturned and then it was stayed. And so it's been kind of confusing in the court as to when it's really relevant. And also the fact that a lot of tenants are, facing eviction because they have 6 months arrears or 8 months arrears or 20 months arrears. Like the current arrears balances are kind of astronomical. And And so thankfully, we, United Tenants and Legal Aid, we've worked together to cover some higher arrears balances. And then when Legal Aid can assist tenants and giving them that litigation and the legal nuanced defense, our court advocate has been able to at least help tenants come to terms with their landlord and find a reasonable outcome that isn't a sheriff dragging them out of the house. Legal hand too. You can always call legal hand if legal aid isn't available. There's one other thing I wanted to mention. Oh yeah, when you're signing a lease too, I think it's relevant that tenants know, you can cross out stuff that you don't agree with and then initial it. And if your landlord signs the lease after the fact that you've done that, I mean, they're essentially agreeing that, they recognize that you don't recognize the illegal clauses in there. Just to reemphasize, law supersedes a lease. So don't let your landlord feel like, well, you signed your rights away and that's how it is. No, go to court, make it fair for yourself, because you're entitled to certain standards that landlords aren't always willing to give you.
Thanks, Canyon. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. You'll definitely want to make sure, like they were saying, to read a lease before you sign it. It is true that you are protected under state law, even if you sign a lease that has some clauses that are illegal. But obviously it's ideal to not, have to deal with that in the first place. Or, we do hear from tenants who sometimes have signed a lease that has illegal statements in it, and then they think that they're held to that. So it's really good to recognize that as well. And like Canyon was saying, there are also evictions going on for rental arrears. So if you know someone who is facing an eviction for rental arrears, or if you are behind on rent at all as well, you can actually apply for the New York State Emergency Rental Assistance Program, or ERAP. You can apply online or by phone. And this program is really helpful in that they periodically do obtain new funds for the program. So you may get your application paid out, but also during the time that your application is pending, your eviction will actually be stayed. So you will not be able to be evicted during the time that your case is under review.
And if I can just add quickly too, so say you have a pending ERAP application and your landlord takes you to court. A lot of tenants appear before the court without representation. And when I was court watching last week, I noticed that Judge Rice notified every tenant who entered into a payment agreement, by doing this, you're waiving any further legal defenses. And so that means if you default on that payment agreement, the eviction can go live, even if you have a ERAP application somewhere in the ether. So, be aware when you're entering into these repayment agreements, the court may pressure you, the landlord and their lawyer are likely to pressure you to enter into this agreement. But if it's something that you're not ready to commit to, and maybe $50 doesn't seem like much at the time, but over time it builds up, and that's just for Albany housing. Some landlords will have tenants enter into a payment agreement that's $1,000 extra a month. Be aware that by entering into that payment agreement, you're waiving protections that you're actually entitled to with ERAP. So it may make sense to say, no, I would rather this whole thing get adjourned until ERAP makes a final decision, because in that case, you're able to sustain that eviction protection that by entering into an agreement, you're otherwise waiving. I just think that that's really important for a lot of tenants to be aware of.
Yeah, thanks, Canyon. Thanks for mentioning that. So just a couple of other resources for rental assistance. Like Canyon had mentioned, United Tenants of Albany does do rental assistance. In some cases, Albany County DSS may be able to provide rental assistance. Catholic Charities Tri-County Services. Canyon touched on this as well, but legal aid services, they are obviously mostly known for providing free civil legal services, but they also do have a rental assistance program. So they're another good resource to reach out to, especially if you are actively facing an eviction. And a couple of other resources include Trinity Alliance and St. Catherine's Center for Children. And I think that about wraps it up for today. So this is my contact information. Like I said, if you have any questions about good cause, or if you need to talk about a specific situation offline, please feel free to reach out. I can be reached at dsmith@albanyny.gov or 518-694-0066. And again, just know that you have these protections and it's your choice whether or not you want to use them. But if you have any questions about how to go about doing that, or if you need some help, please feel free to reach out to United Tenants or Legal Aid or my office as well. And Canyon, anything to add?
If you want to get a hold of me, my email's canyon, CANYON @unitedtenantsalbany.org, and numbers 518-436-8997, extension 104 is my direct line. We also are accepting walk-ins, so if you're in a state of crisis, come to the door and somebody will be right there to assist you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining tonight. Thanks for sitting in, Canyon. Appreciate your time. And everybody have a good rest of your evening. Thank you so much.